Welcome to the debate. Today we are looking at what is essentially the Mount Everest of language learning. We aren't talking about the people who hike to base camp, the folks who can order a coffee in Paris or ask where the library is in Tokyo. We are talking about the summit. We are talking about native likeness.
Right, that rare, incredibly elusive tier where you are functionally indistinguishable from a native speaker, the point where the listener completely forgets you aren't one of them.
Exactly. And this brings us to a central question about human potential and really about how our brains work. Is achieving that level of proficiency the result of rigorous, strategic, cognitive architecture, basically engineering the brain through drills? Or is it a holistic, emotional journey fueled by identity shifts, social bonding, and what the Romantics would call Sehnsucht?
It is the difference between constructing a building and growing a garden. One implies blueprints, scaffolding, and engineering, while the other implies organic absorption and sunlight. And I suspect as we dig into the source material today, we are going to find that our romantic notions of absorption are often just a cover story for some very, very hard work.
Well, to frame this, we really have to stick with that Mount Everest analogy provided in the literature. The research suggests that while not everyone needs to summit Everest to be considered a mountaineer, those who do reach that peak offer us unique lessons.
Right. Most people are perfectly happy reaching base camp. They just want to communicate, and that is a noble goal. But we are analyzing the outliers today, the people who went all the way to the top.
And there's a real tension here in how they got there. I'm going to be arguing for the romantic view. The idea that falling in love with a culture, the sort of osmosis theory, and deep identity transformation are the primary drivers.
And I am going to take the side of the scientist. I believe talent is largely a myth, and that success comes from deliberate practice and a construction of complex mental representations. Basically, I intend to show that what looks like magic is actually mechanics.
Well, let's start with the magic then. Let's look at the new global generation. This is a fascinating phenomenon appearing in the data. We have learners like Carl and William. These are young guys who didn't sit down with flashcards or grammar books. Carl played Minecraft. William watched YouTube videos, and yet they achieved incredibly high proficiency. Carl explicitly stated he passively picked up on English.
Passively. That is the word I always trip over.
But that is his lived experience. He wasn't studying, he was gaming. He was building virtual worlds. This suggests that if the setup is favorable, if the input is engaging enough, the brain does the work for you. It feels less like labor and more like life. He's not thinking about the present perfect tense. He's thinking about how to survive the night in the game.
I think we need to be very careful with the word passive, though. Just because it was fun doesn't mean it wasn't cognitive work. But before I completely dismantle the gamer theory, I want to hear a bit more about this emotional driver you mentioned earlier. Sehnsucht.
Oh, it's a beautiful German concept. It translates roughly to life longing or an intense, almost painful yearning. The research highlights a woman named Sarah. Her story is just incredible. She watched a car advertisement on TV that happened to feature the theme song from The Godfather.
Wait, a car commercial? That was the catalyst?
It was more than a catalyst. It was a portal. She saw that, and later she saw Petula Clark speaking French on TV. It triggered this deep, aching, emotional longing to be elsewhere, to be someone else entirely. That yearning was a stronger driver than any classroom discipline could ever be.
So it wasn't about the practical utility of the language at all.
Not at all. It was about identity. Or take Carrie, another subject in the study. She fell in love with Italian. She didn't call it a subject she was studying. She called it amore. She said the language felt rooted inside me. That is an emotional bond, not a cognitive strategy. You don't get rooted inside me from a textbook.
Yeah, it's a compelling narrative. Really, it is. But we have to look at survivorship bias here. For every kid who absorbs English playing Minecraft, there are thousands who play for years and only learn to shout game over or noob. And for every person who falls in love with the idea of Italian, there are many who drop out of the class 3 weeks later because conjugating verbs is boring.
So what separates the ones who summit from the ones who quit, in your view?
The science of deliberate practice. This brings us to the work of Professor Anders Ericsson, which is so central to our source material. We have to address the pop culture myth of the 10,000-hour rule.
You mean the idea that if you just do something for 10,000 hours, you become an expert? You were saying that is wrong?
It is fundamentally misunderstood. Experience without focus is just stagnation. The text gives us the example of Manny Vallarino. He swam for 20 years, competitively. He easily logged 10,000 hours in the pool, but he never became an elite swimmer. He never made the Olympics. In fact, he barely improved after his first few years. Why?
I assume you were going to tell me he was swimming wrong.
He was just doing. He was engaging in naive practice. He went to the pool, he swam his laps, he went home. He wasn't engaging in deliberate practice, which requires intense focus, immediate feedback, and very specific goals to correct errors. Compare Vallarino swimming to how he learned to play the song Vincent by Don McLean on the guitar.
That is a complex song. Lots of intricate finger-picking.
Exactly. He didn't just play it over and over and hope it would get better. That is what he did in the pool. With the guitar, he transcribed every single note. He analyzed the structure. He built what Erickson calls mental representations.
That is a term that comes up a lot. Can we define that clearly for the listeners? Mental representations.
Sure, think of it like a mental zip file or a chunk. A novice looks at a guitar neck and sees 6 individual strings and individual frets. They have to think, okay, index finger goes to the 2nd string, 3rd fret. It is slow, it takes a lot of RAM. An expert looks at the neck and sees patterns. They see a C major shape. They don't have to think about where the finger goes. They access a pre-built mental structure. You only build those through active, painful study, not by just feeling the music.
I see the distinction, but language isn't a guitar solo. It is a living, breathing thing. You can't transcribe a conversation at a crowded bar in real time.
But the mechanism of mastery is the same. Look at Christopher in the source material. He mastered Chinese, a notoriously difficult language for Westerners. He didn't just yearn for it like Sarah did. He used specific strategies. He was on a tight budget, right? So he wrote Chinese characters on reused baking paper.
Baking paper? Like for cookies?
Yes, because it is slick, he would write the character, wipe it off, and write it again, over and over. He claimed to be bad at memory, yet he succeeded. Why? Because he built a system. He focused on the mechanics. He didn't wait for osmosis. He built the mental representations of those characters through sheer repetition and focus.
To talk about talent, or at least the predisposition for it. The data points to mimicry and musicality as undeniable accelerators.
Talent is a dangerous word. It is usually an excuse for people who don't want to do the work. Oh, I'm just not talented at languages, they say.
Perhaps people use it as an excuse, sure, but look at Joy. She grew up as a missionary kid. She would mimic church songs and news reporters specifically to avoid being a bumbling foreigner. Or Denny. The text says he had a fascination with sound. There is a direct link in the material between singing, musicality, and the ability to reproduce an accent. Joy played music by ear. You can't drill that kind of auditory sensitivity. It is innate.
I reject that limiting belief. The material explicitly cites Steve Martin, the comedian and banjo player, who said, "I had no talent. None." It cites Mario Vargas Llosa, the Nobel Prize winner. These are masters who claim it was all work.
Those are artists, though, not language learners.
The principle holds. But if you want language-specific data, let me give you a counterexample from the study. Amelia. She was told to mime in her choir class because she was so unmusical, she couldn't carry a tune in a bucket. And Thamar Cozy. She was kicked out of singing class entirely?
And they achieved native likeness?
Both of them. Despite having no ear for music, they achieved top-tier proficiency in their target languages. If musical talent was a prerequisite, they should have failed. They should have been stuck at base camp.
That is an interesting point, though I would argue they succeeded in spite of that lack, perhaps by compensating with extra effort, but for those like Joey, the talent was the engine that made it easier.
Or consider this. What looks like talent is actually self-monitoring. It is high standards. Christopher didn't just hear the tones in Mandarin. He was obsessed with getting them exactly right every time. That isn't a magical ear. That is a refusal to accept mediocrity. It is cognitive rigor. He monitored his output constantly.
But that rigor creates anxiety, and anxiety shuts down learning. My argument is that the lazy learner, the one who relaxes, often succeeds because they integrate the language seamlessly into their life.
The lazy learner. Who calls themselves that?
Hannah did. In the study, she was called one of the laziest students by her professor. She didn't do the homework, she didn't do the drills you love so much. Yet, she succeeded. Why? Because she lived her life in English. She didn't study, she existed. Or take Judith. She learned Norwegian simply by leaving the radio on all day while doing housework.
Ah, the background noise theory.
It worked. Judith became a professor of Viking studies. That is a pretty high ceiling for someone who just left the radio on. And look at Uwe. He talks about his identity like a Rubik's Cube. He shifts personalities. He says the language is a garment you wear. He isn't analyzing grammar rules. He is changing his clothes. It is a holistic shift.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that osmosis takes you all the way to the summit. Passive listening is better than nothing, but it hits a ceiling. The material shows that true mastery prevents fossilization.
Explain that term for us, fossilization.
It's a concept in linguistics where a learner reaches a point of good enough. They can order dinner, they can chat with friends, they're understood, so their brain just stops correcting errors. The mistakes become fossilized, hardened like rock. You prevent that only through active anxiety and conscious correction.
Can you give an example of someone who actively fought this?
Look at Colin. He was a very advanced learner, but he hit a plateau. He realized he could order dinner, but he couldn't discuss the Suez Crisis or 9/11 or complex politics.
So he just studied more?
He had to up his game through conscious study. He didn't just wait for the Suez Crisis to come up in casual conversation at the pub. He had to go seek that vocabulary out. And look at Christopher's feedback loop. This is brilliant and aggressive.
This is the guy with the baking paper?
Yes, he used social engineering. He realized that native speakers are polite. They won't correct you if they generally understand you. They don't want to be rude. So Christopher would bait them. He would intentionally make mistakes or say things in a way that forced them to drop their politeness and correct him back. He manipulated the social environment to extract data. That is deliberate practice. That is not magic. That is strategic manipulation.
I see the strategy there, and I admit, it is clever. But I think you are missing the fuel source. You are talking about the engine, the practice, the feedback loops, the baking paper. But what puts the gas in the tank? Why would Christopher bother doing all that? Why would anyone write Chinese characters on baking paper for hours?
Professional necessity.
It is love, it is social bonding, it is amour. Colin, whom you just mentioned with the Suez Crisis, he didn't just study because he loved politics. He was dating Utah.
Ah, the romantic partner, the classic motivator.
It is incredibly powerful.
The text says he had to express emotions to her that he had never said in English. He had to find words for his heart. That is high-octane fuel.
Or look at Rianne. She wanted to be part of the community. Or Sarah wanted to be Petula Clark. It is a desire for identity merger. You don't get that drive from a textbook or a desire for mental representations.
I agree that fuel is needed, but I completely disagree that the fuel is always positive. High-octane fuel often comes from negative emotions, panic, or shame. The literature calls these directed motivational currents, or DMCs.
Like a riptide?
Exactly. A powerful current that pulls you toward a goal, often against your will. But look at what triggers them. Look at Leslie. She wasn't motivated by love or romance. She was motivated by a rude comment from a customer and the sheer terror of losing her job. She thought, this is never going to happen to me again.
That is a fair point. Survival is a very strong motivator.
And Rianne, whom you mentioned, she had to learn German in 1 year to teach physics. That wasn't a romance. That was a strict deadline. And honestly, often passing as a native is a defense mechanism.
How so?
The study mentions Teresa. She learned to pass as a native specifically to avoid Heil Hitler comments because she was German living abroad. She wanted to blend in to avoid abuse. Carrie learned to pass to avoid being the ugly American stereotype.
It is a strategic integration to avoid pain, not just a warm, fuzzy feeling of belonging.
That is a darker side of it, certainly. But whether it is love or defense, whether it's running towards something or running away from something, the result is the same: ownership. This is where I think the immersion argument really wins. Proficiency leads to a sense of legitimacy.
Legitimacy?
Yes. Livia suffered from imposter syndrome for a long time. She felt like a fraud, until she accepted she was a bridge between cultures. Once she claimed that ownership, she could engage in language play. Teresa making jokes, for instance. You can't joke in a language you don't own. It becomes a comfortable voice. You stop translating and start being.
That is a compelling argument. But have you considered that you cannot own what you haven't bought and paid for?
Meaning.
Meaning, ownership requires mastering the structural rules first. There is a great quote from John Mayer, the musician. In the material, he gives advice to guitarists. He says, learn the building blocks and scales, not just the songs.
Again with the guitar analogies.
Because it applies perfectly. He says if you just learn the songs, you are trapped in them. But if you learn the scales, the structure, you can improvise. You cannot play with the language until you have built the mental representations to bypass your short-term memory limits. If you don't know the rules, your joke isn't funny, it is just a grammatical error.
But if you only know the rules, you are a robot. You are an encyclopedia, not a speaker. You might be technically perfect, but you have no soul in the language.
And if you only have love and vibes, you are a fossilized amateur. True ownership is dangerous, too. The material talks about identity erasure. It is not all sunshine and bridges. Ira felt not really from anywhere. Timur called his identity messed up. Mastery requires managing this complexity with a professional core, like Juve did. It is not just slipping on a garment, it is stitching together a fragmented self.
I think we are reaching a synthesis here. We are acknowledging that while deliberate practice, the feedback, the goals, the focus, the baking paper, is the engine that drives progress.
The fuel is the Sehnsucht, the love, the fear, or the deep social need to belong.
I can agree with that. The engine won't run without fuel.
And the fuel won't take you anywhere without a working engine. You can yearn for Paris all you want, but if you don't conjugate your verbs, you are not going to fit in.
For me, the ultimate takeaway is that language learning is a heart project. It is about the garment of identity and the magic of connection that makes the hard work feel like pleasure work. Even the hard grinding you described Christopher with his baking paper was driven by a connection to the culture. He didn't write those characters for no reason.
And my takeaway is a reminder that 1,000 hours of deliberate practice beats 10,000 hours of haphazard doing. Passion is necessary, but without the mental representations and the refusal to fossilize, one remains at the base of the mountain. You must be willing to correct your own Vincent, note by note.
Ultimately, native likeness is a two-way street. The speaker claims ownership, but the listener must believe it. It requires the soul of a poet to want it.
And the discipline of a scientist to achieve it.
That's a wrap for the debate. Thank you for listening.